And welcome back, listeners. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Threat Podcast. As is normal, I'm joined by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matthew Eby, in nice, coolish wintertime there in Kansas City. How's everything going today, Matt?
It's great. Yeah, it's the weather has been extremely mild in February here. Joanne and I have been out hiking, a couple times during the week. It's been absolutely beautiful. Can't complain.
I love that you're getting some of that nice weather. We're watching the Winter Olympics right now in Milan. They've got lots of. I was watching it the other day. A couple of the things I've gotten a chance to see, but it was coming down like in buckets as they were skiing down the slopes. I was just thinking, how do people do Winter Olympics? Because as you know, I'm an avid golfer. I live in Scottsdale, Phoenix area for a reason. As I mentioned before in some of our podcast openings, Chamber of Commerce weather is what we've got going on here. Arguably the nicest winter, quote unquote, winter in Scottsdale that I've had in the almost 30 years that I've lived out here. So I feel for those, but you're getting a nice moderate winter so far in Kansas City. So good for you.
Yeah, it's been beautiful. I wouldn't call this moderate. I would call this just fantastic. So we're if we can get out during the day for hiking and things like that, it's just beautiful. So
Well, Matt, always great to have you on here with me. Thank you, listeners, again for joining us for another episode as we start digging into it, as they say.
Carter, if you remember in the last episode, we kind of held that moment that was really familiar. The conversation, where they had the manager and the examiner in the room and the tension between them. Well, the tension never really exploded. But if you remember, when we were in there having the discussion, the conversation kind of tightened a bit.
Sure.
What I want to do was I want to slow that moment down a bit and do some diagnosis of that. Because sometimes when we have those moments, that disagreement doesn't completely disappear, but it gets reinterpreted. And when that reinterpretation starts to feel like exposure, especially to reputation, the room changes. So, if it's okay with you in this episode, I'd like to go back there. And last episode, we left that conversation hanging intentionally.
Yeah, we absolutely intentionally did that, and that's what I love about this podcast, especially for those who got a chance to listen to episode 2 or really left them hanging, right? But that's right. It was a conversation where nothing blew up, right? Nobody exploded in anything. No
Right.
voices were raised. Yet, something it shifted. It was noticeable that it shifted.
Yeah, it was calm. The conversation was calm and professional. And if you recall the conversation, the examiner noted that there wasn't any violation of law and no breakdowns in controls, and that everything about the discretionary choices that were made were defensible. But yet, in that conversation, you could feel something shift.
It was a little, I mean, you said tightening, right? I mean, it was uncomfortable for sure, right? The moment for the manager, which ended up ultimately making it tense for both parties that were involved.
Yeah, we've been in those situations, right? It was the moment when you, representing the manager, said that variability in the exercise of discretion is hard to defend. The conversation didn't escalate into an argument between us, but the room tightened. You could feel it. I could feel it. Suddenly, it wasn't about what was reasonable anymore. It was about what would be safe for you to hear from the examiner and accept.
Yeah. So is this tension the manifestation of an invisible threat for the manager?
Exactly. And for the examiner, there is exposure on both sides of the difference in the point of view, the disagreement. And then the focus shifts. What felt urgent changes. It's no longer about the beneficiaries anymore. It's no longer about their way they're being treated. It's not about the nuances in the trust language or about defending the standardized approach. Now it's about the exposure,
Yeah.
but not the exposure to loss or the exposure to market risk. It's the exposure about how the work is going to be reported, about how it's going to be written up, and how the ROE, the report of examination, what it might trigger inside of your organization. That's the pivot. That's the moment where both sides are now focused on how it's going to look when it's written up and documented.
Yeah, and that's real, right? I mean, this could result in a management rating downgrade. And as the manager, it's not something I would welcome. It's going to affect my credibility, the credibility of the entire trust team that surrounds us, or if it is bad enough, it could affect our organization's business. And I kind of want to pull in a little bit of something you taught me about early on when we were, building out, Epic. You shared with me, and if this isn't the right time to talk about this, we don't have to, but it made me start thinking about when you told me about that acronym of MOICA. And I'm just wondering if how that ties into that uncomfortable situation.
It's exactly the situation. That's the rating system that the examiner would use. And the M in there is the management rating. And yes, that's exactly right. That risk that we're talking about isn't imaginary. The manager's reputation is at risk. A downgrade could infect not only the manager, but the strategic direction of the entire organization. It could affect the careers of the manager, of the staff. It could affect what the institution is allowed to do. If it's bad enough, the examiner might write them up with a C&D, a cease and desist, and they wouldn't be able to accept new business. So when someone hears the word pattern in an exam context, that's not just emotional. It can affect the management rating, as we're talking about, and it can restrict growth. It has consequences. That's real institutional pressure. And that's what makes this example complex. I want to be really clear with something foundational. In this industry, in the trust industry, fiduciary duty tracks to the beneficiary, but the risk of the reputational harm tracks to the institution and its management.
Yeah, and I can remember when you were talking to me about that, those scores from those examiners that could monetarily have some consequences as well, right? So most of the time when the institution protects its reputation, it's protecting its beneficiaries' interests too, right?
Yes, but not always. It doesn't always happen in the same way and not always in the same moment. When both fiduciary duty and protecting the organization are active at the same time, the hierarchy matters.
So how does oversight fit into that?
That's a great question. Oversight, whether internal by the board or supervisory oversight by the regulators, exists to safeguard the primary duty of the trustee, the duty of loyalty to the beneficiaries. The board oversees management. The examiner evaluates whether that oversight is working, but the duty of loyalty is not owed to oversight
Hmm.
or to the board or to the institution.
Huh.
This is a one-way street. It
Wow.
is not reciprocal. It is owed to the beneficiaries, period. Here's where the shift actually happens. It happens when we start asking how this will look before we've asked what the beneficiary is owed.
Man, my head goes in so many different places when I think about obviously what we do on the daily, right? Um, that fiduciary duty and protecting the beneficiaries. I mean, this is so eye-opening right now. So you're saying it's not the evaluation itself.
Not at all. It's not the evaluation. The evaluation isn't the problem. Oversight isn't the problem. The problem is when we start thinking about how this is going to be judged before we fully work through what loyalty requires. That's the shift. When we start getting protective in advance because we're concerned about protecting the reputation of the organization or ourselves.
That's a major shift. So and that changes ultimately how we treat that disagreement.
Exactly right. That's the shift that we're talking about. Because once we start worrying about how it will look, the disagreement doesn't feel like information anymore. It feels like risk. And when it feels like risk, we try to control it instead of understanding it. That's the moment everything changes.
Yeah.
And this doesn't just happen in examination meetings. It happens when a beneficiary pushes back or any other time that you experience dissatisfaction with anything. If a beneficiary has a concern about a distribution, they come back and question it. Or someone says, I don't think that's fair, when they ask for an appeal. That moment for the client is dissatisfaction. And for the organization, it can feel like exposure, exposure to a complaint, exposure to escalation or litigation, exposure to reputational consequence. And once it feels like exposure, things change. The instinct, the natural instinct, isn't to explore that disagreement, it's to stabilize it
Now, when you say stabilize it how?
by leaning harder on precedent, the things we know, by tightening the explanation, escalating to committee, by choosing the interpretation that's safest to defend. None of that's unethical. None of that violates the policy. In fact, most of it looks prudent. But stabilization has a cost. It reduces the range of reasonable options. Now we've limited our choices. And when the range shrinks, disagreement disappears. When reputational exposure feels real, disagreement feels unsafe. Uniformity feels safer. This is why we all want to try to force agreement in meetings,
Sure.
and that the person who disagrees seems like an outcast. Precedent feels protective, not because anyone is unethical, but because the consequences are real. When reputations are at stake, that risk gets loud. And when it gets loud, judgment can start optimizing for defensibility. We try to protect ourselves.
Man, I'm just thinking about, judgments and disagreements and the whole thing. So really meaning we start thinking about just how the optics are, right?
Exactly right. And something subtle happens. The beneficiary hasn't changed. The terms of the trust haven't changed. The law hasn't changed. But what feels urgent has.
So now you have two things are active simultaneously.
Exactly what we said.
Yeah.
The duty of loyalty to the beneficiary and exposure to reputational risk, whether institutional or personal. That's exactly what we started talking about with the examiner and the manager at the beginning.
Yep.
And when both are active at the same time, Priority matters.
Yeah. So, meaning one of those is going to inevitably, right? You can only prioritize. So, if you got two things simultaneously going on, only one of those is going to get prioritized over the other.
That's exactly right. That's the question. So, if we're sitting there and we're considering whose interests come first, the beneficiaries or ours, which one is going to come out on top?
Yeah. So what's the manager supposed to do? Just ignore the risk to his reputation, the risk to his staff? I mean, talk about rocking a hard place.
Of course not. Those risks matter. Oversight matters. Management ratings matter.
Yeah.
But disagreement between the manager and the examiner, or between the institution and the best beneficiary in that dissatisfaction example, isn't the enemy. This is the most important thing we're talking about here. For all of our listeners and everybody, disagreement is information.
That is so well put. And when you just think about your everyday life, you think about disagreement, like, let's agree to disagree, right? So, what you're actually saying is that disagreement is actually useful if you look at it as being useful.
Absolutely. It's data. If no one disagrees, either the answer was obvious or the disagreement is not safe to voice. And those are very, very different things.
Yeah, totally. So I think I get it. I think I understand. The danger isn't the disagreement itself, but what about the risk to my reputation, right? The exposure to my staff, if they can't rely on the standards, right? The prudent standards we work so hard to establish.
Yeah. But the danger isn't the risk. The danger is when the disagreement starts to feel like exposure
Yeah.
and the system moves to eliminate it instead of examine it. So if we hold that disagreement for a while and we try to examine the disagreement, when we move it and try to take our time to hold it, as opposed to trying to move it to what's safest to defend before we've fully examined what the disagreement is revealing, that's the invisible threat.
Yeah.
Not misconduct, not violation, but an invisible shift in the sequence. Defensibility comes first and interpretation comes second. And over time, judgment becomes rigid without anyone ever intending it to be. Carter, for the benefit of our new listeners and our old listeners, I suppose, can you name what changed in that moment when exposure entered the room?
Yeah. I mean, it was clear that no policy was violated, right?
Yep.
No misconduct occurred, but pressure entered the room. And what felt urgent changed.
Yep.
When exposure becomes loud, priority can simply reorder, right? And in fiduciary work, the order of obligations matters.
That was really well stated. You're absolutely right. And in episode 3, our prior episode, the moment you as manager began worrying about credibility in your reputation and process, the tension in the room increased between you and the examiner, as you remember,
Yep.
and that tension mattered. It was so important. It revealed that competing obligations were active at the same time.
Yeah.
That was the indicator that the invisible threat was starting to take hold. The question isn't whether disagreement or dissatisfaction exist. The question is whether we can be comfortable enough to hold them, to understand what they are revealing, what they're telling us. If disagreement is data, the question isn't how to suppress it, it's how to make it visible, how to examine it, before the invisible threat quietly narrows what we see and then what we consider as possible answers. Because once the range of reasonable options shrinks, it's really difficult to recover what was lost at that moment. And that's why getting the right help matters. Someone who can help us see what we can't see from inside that pressure, not to override our judgment or not to dilute our authority, but to keep the disagreement visible long enough to interpret it well.
Well, because if you've been in that room, you know that moment. The tension rises, the pressure builds, and the instinct is to naturally want to move on, to resolve it, to smooth it out, to fix it, right? Sometimes the only way to hold that moment well is to get the right help. Not someone to decide for you, but someone who can help hold you in the moment, quote unquote, right? Before exposure sets the direction. We'll pick that up next time in episode 5. Most people move past this moment. As we keep saying, we don't. We want to thank you, listeners, for joining us for another episode of The Invisible Threat. And we can't wait for you to come back and see how we continue down this path. So for my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matthew Eby, I'm Carter Wilcoxson, thanking you. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And we are so thankful to have you join us for each and every one of these episodes as we get into that wonderful brain that is my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt Eby. So, Matt, thank you so much for pulling all that stuff out. You put me right back in those moments while we were going through that. So thank you for that. I really do appreciate it.
It's been great, Carter. Good seeing you again, and look forward to our next episode 5, where we talk about the right help.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us. Make sure to go ahead and see us next week on here. Thank you again, everybody, and have a wonderful day. We'll see you next time on the Invisible Threat Podcast. Thank you, everybody.